So I thought, this being the end of the year and Christmas Eve and what have you, and arguably the kind of a nice time to get into the winter invitation, really, to think deep thoughts. I thought that today we would discuss one of the perennial problems of philosophy, and it's usually listed that way: problems of philosophy or issues in philosophy, and that is the question of the existence of God. Now, you would think that after, so many centuries of talking about this, that we've heard just about everything there is to say on this topic. I would just introduce one small rejoinder to that, and that is that many of the discussions about the existence of God turn out to be discussions about religion. You know, um, recently, an author, uh, great humanist, um, Christopher Hitchens, wrote a book, God is Not Great. Um, but as gifted a writer as he is, much of the piece was really about critique of religion. And similarly, the well respected Sir Bertrand Russell uh, penned a very famous essay, very widely read, Why I Am Not a Christian. And again, the question of the existence of God doesn't really show up that much. What shows up is a critique of religion, which is understandable. Um, but I think the question of whether or not humanity has been helped or hurt by religion is one we can certainly discuss. But perhaps we can put it in brackets a little bit as a separate question. The question about the existence of God, though, is a different question. It pertains to metaphysics and especially the relationship of God as a concept to reality, metaphysics being the focus of philosophy for many, many centuries, and even today. So, so we're just going to say nolo contendiere, right, when it comes to the issue of religion, and focus in instead on the question of the existence of God. Now, over the years, there have been interesting arguments made for and against, but taking a 35,000-foot view of it all, it's been kind of like a tennis match, right? One side presents an argument for the existence of God, the other side refutes it. But the interesting thing about this is both sides actually sharpen their argument. They become more acute, more focused, and frankly, a lot more interesting as time goes on. And so, this strange thing, an aspect of perhaps dialectics, that the advancement of the question of the existence of God has benefited from the oppositional relationship between believers and and atheists. Case in point, um, the medieval philosopher, late classical medieval philosopher Boethius, wrote a really interesting argument for the existence of God, where he touched on it, discussing a very ancient philosopher, Porphyry, and his argument against the existence of God. And St. Thomas Aquinas actually touched on that in his uh, arguments for the existence of God, saying that, look, Boethius, Porphyry was right. The question of evil, the existence of evil, is the number one reason uh, against or in opposition to the existence of God. If God is good, why did he create a world with such massive, as Richard Bernstein of the New School would call it, gratuitous evil, right? Um, and but at the same time, there have been very powerful arguments mustered for the existence of God. Uh, Perhaps the most famous of them is St. Anselm's ontological argument, which has great elegance and great efficiency. He defines God elegantly as that than which nothing greater can be thought. And he says, well, obviously God must exist since existence is greater than non-existence. And, and then St. Thomas came across and said, "Oh, wait a minute there, existence is a separate category. You can't mix it up with, predicates, as they say. You can't say it's an attribute." And Immanuel Kant took that argument a little bit further. The question is St. Anselm using that existence in that way, that thing that than which nothing is greater in that way? We can bracket that, put it in parentheses. But oddly enough, and this gets to my earlier point, the debate over the ontological argument generated a focus on existence. Okay, so now we have another turn of the wheel. And then existence becomes a very eerie, in the words of some philosophers, category of life, right? Part of the human condition. It's not like anything else. We can't really define it, and yet it's the ground of everything that we do. And so, what are we to say about existence? Does existence just kind of happen, sort of thing? It certainly seems to be something different. So, then we have whether or not things we can think of actually exist. And one of the uh, rejoinders is, well, I can think of all kinds of things that don't exist, unicorns and so forth. And that's certainly true. Especially today, we see unicorns all the way. Um, but as Descartes points out, all of these creations of our mind, our imagination, as interesting and as beautiful or wonderful as they are, as CGI can bring before us, they're all based on reality, right? They're all, the unicorn has a horse's body, kind of, and the rhinoceros horn or some kind of horn, but they're not just ex nihilo, right? They're not just out of nothing. They're out of stuff that already exists. And so we're back to that again. Whence existence, right? Or as the philosopher Leibniz put it, well, why is there something rather than nothing? Just as easily been absolute nothing, right? But there is something. And the something that is not a thing, namely existence itself, is a very curious thing and has perplexed philosophers of the East and West to no end. The Tao, which is not God, right, but is something that points at God, um, says that the way that can be named is not the constant way. Well, think about that. It's true. Now, our mind wants to encapsulate that in some kind of definition, right? We want to have a comprehensive understanding of things. One of the reasons why the existence of God is so important is because when we have conversations about it, oftentimes those conversations devolve into, yeah, but what about these miracles with the people going up to heaven in chariots and walking on the water and raising of the dead and, the parting of the Red Sea and all these things that seem to go against, the natural order of things, right? Now, putting aside the possibility that some of them are allegorical, um, there's an incommensurability issue here, right? Because, if you sign on to the existence of God, then why would any of these other issues be of any concern? Certainly, the existence of the universe is far greater than any of these other things. Creating existence out of nothing um, would make these other miracles and so forth uh, of lesser note, So, um, so there's the ground of the arguments themselves. Now, when it comes to existence, which is so difficult and such an interesting basis for the existence of God, one of the interesting reflections that I have had for many, many years is I'm an amateur astronomer, and I've always been fascinated by the SETI project, which is the search for extraterrestrial life. Um, it'd be cool if we found, radio waves from the distant galaxies or something. But we've been at it, let's be honest, for 40 years now, and not a peep. I mean, some things have come up, but nothing really substantial. And that's kind of a strange thing, don't you think? That, the idea that we are alone in this vast universe that the Webb telescope just disclosed to us, and before that, the Hubble telescope, just in unimaginable amounts of distance. So if there was because the speed of sound, of course, if there were uh, life, elsewhere in the universe, certainly we would have heard that by now, right? But we continue the search because, there's a little bit of St. Thomas, the doubter in all of us, hopefully. And and being a doubter is a good thing, makes you stronger. The other issue that I think is really interesting is to think about in this regard is consciousness itself. You know, now I'm not going to quibble with environmental philosophers or ecological thinkers who argue that there's essentially no difference in life forms. We're more advanced or something like that. But as Marx put it, right? Human beings and ants both build houses, but the difference is that the ant builds it by rote instinct, and humans build it in their mind before they build it in reality. I sometimes play Pavarotti's Nessun Dorma for my students in order to illustrate a point raised by my professor from long ago, Rainer Schulman of the New School. His early work on the Christian mystic and philosopher Meister Eckhart was brilliant in that he talked about how when you listen to some piece of music that's truly gripping, takes you away, you're sharing an identity with the musician. But the truth of the matter is there's a third relationship there. It's the listener, the performer, and then the music itself. So there are instances, Reiner argued, in which our identity kind of escapes from its self-absorption and survival, and is able to reach, another kind of level. There's a peak of the mind, as Meister Eckhart said, that is absolutely breathtaking and transcendental in its ability. And so the argument from human genius is pretty special. You don't have to go with Pavarotti. Um, Other songs that I've had that reaction to, I remember seeing a YouTube video of an impromptu concert between CeeLo Green, where Prince was in the audience, and they just threw a guitar literally at him. He got up on the stage, and it was just mesmerizing, actually. And you could really sense the loss in the moment. Um, so there are these kind of not signs. We're not going for proof of the existence of God here. We're just raising things that we think are interesting. Um, that kind of point in a direction of something. Um, uh, the other aspect of this is consciousness itself. You know, the philosopher Edmund Husserl, who was the teacher of, the founders pretty much of all of the existential movement of the 20th century. He argued in his wonderful book Ideas that when we perceive things, we always just initially perceive them kind of vaguely. They're out of sync. We're not entirely sure what it is we're looking at. An apple tree, for example, we might not be able to discern it as an apple tree right away. And so we have what my professor at the New School, I love these terms, partial adumbration of this apple tree, you see. And as we think about it, as we reflect on it, we study it, we get more complete understanding of the apple tree. We don't never get to the point where we say it's 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's, kind of unique to mathematics. But what we and other manifestations of math in the sciences. But what we do get is this kind of clarity that exists only with real things, Husserl argued. But what Husserl comes back to again and again in his philosophy is the idea of originary position, which is in consciousness we're talking. And originary position refers to the starting point of perception. And I think that's an interesting way to think about arguments or suggestions, as I'm calling it, for the existence of God. Because originary perception has to have a ground for something, right? And so this ground of originary positions. It's like an initial starting point, which itself seems to suggest kind of necessary being, right? One of the classic arguments for the existence of God. So the uniqueness of consciousness, I think, does add a lot to this. I think our relentless search for things is another part of it. But, we do live in an age where we have so many instances of false equivalencies. Just as existence is not like the other things we can say about existence, so too the philosophical question about the existence of God is not equivalent to questions about religion, about which we can discuss. We can have politics and wonder why this and that and discuss issues and social issues. But this is a unique question. It's a question of metaphysics and reality. So I hope you enjoyed this brief discussion, and have a nice new year, everyone.